The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our second installation in the Storage Management Lab series. Before we get started, y'all know the drill. If you could shoot a Y or a yes into your questions pane, just let me know you can hear me and see my screen. Awesome. Looks good. Great. So really happy to have y'all here. Thanks again for joining us. As you should be able to see, this is the Storage Management Migration Support Lab. It's going to discuss using some provided utilities for upgrading from existing report and theme storage to storage management, which, as you all know, was released in version 2020.1 of Exago. This is the second in our series of storage management labs. We're following Travis's general overview just 2 days ago and preceding 2 additional installments that will detail permissioning and then customization. And those are coming next Tuesday and Thursday. Today, I'm going to demonstrate using the tools provided to migrate reports from the file system storage, as well as a .NET-based folder management implementation. A quick warning, I just want to let you all know, this lab is going to be one of the longer ones in this series. We're covering a few different utilities, various ways to use each one. Additionally, given that every implementation is different and customized to some extent, there is still no guarantee that your very specific use cases will be covered today, but we do hope to give you a general overview of the most common migration scenarios with the intention of the permissioning lab next week, rounding out the migration process. If you do have any additional questions, of course, please always feel free to submit a ticket to our services team so that we can address your environment-specific questions directly. And on that note, I do have my whole team here. Nick, Tom, and Travis are all here for questions today. So feel free to drop a hello to them in the questions pane, and they will be happy to address any questions you have throughout the presentation. All right. So quick overview of today's lab. We're going to first talk about the general transitioning process start to finish. Most of that process will be covered on today's lab. We're going to go through examples of reading existing content directly from the file system. Following that, we'll talk about the same if your current storage is a database using our previously provided folder management assembly. Now, both of those processes will generate an intermediate JSON file. So we'll then spend some time discussing that file and its use in ultimately loading your storage management database with your legacy content. Finally, we will discuss admin console settings that should be updated after the utilities are complete to ensure Exago can utilize the storage management database that you just configured and loaded. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to talk about the transitioning process. The first step in this process is always to identify what you're using today. This might seem obvious, but there are a few options. You might be using file system storage today. That was the legacy out-of-box report and theme file storage method. Cloud storage is an option as well. The .NET folder management assembly previously provided via download on our support site, or a SOAP web service. We're not going to spend too much time discussing the SOAP web service migration process today. We do only have so much time. And we would really encourage you to submit a services ticket if this is your legacy method anyway, so that we can discuss your custom implementation, and we'd like to advise accordingly on migration strategies there. Additionally, one thing I want to mention today is going to focus on the base example of folder management without any customization, as this is the most commonly used version out there. Now, step 2, again, might seem obvious, but we always want to recommend that you guys back up whatever you have before starting this process. Nothing I'm going to show you today is destructive. We are only reading existing content, but it's always best practice to make a backup before beginning this process anyway. All right, so the bulk of this lab is going to be steps 3 and 4. We provide transitioning utilities for use to read the contents of your current report storage. You'll use the appropriate tool based on your current storage method. Utilities will both read the current contents and then generate an intermediate JSON file, like I mentioned. This will save a copy of your legacy storage content. It does allow for manual editing of that JSON file if desired, prior to importing the contents into a new storage management database. Now we provide an additional utility that I will also be demonstrating today that can be used to initialize and load the new storage management database with content from those JSON files. Now, in some cases, you can also use this utility to read directly from your existing report storage and load the database in a single step. We'll talk about those cases as well. In any of these workflows, you must create your storage management database ahead of time. After this, the only steps left are to configure Exago's admin console to connect to the storage management database, and then customize any existing API code to set and utilize identity parameters each time a new session of Exago is instantiated. Now that last bit specifically is going to be covered in our next lab on permissioning. We're going to talk all about the identity parameters and how to use them successfully. And then finally, additional customizations to the out-of-box storage management implementation will be covered in the final lab this month, next Thursday. Great. The utilities listed here are EXEs provided by Exago in your 20.1 install to assist you in this migration. We provide 4 total, 3 of which are used to read the existing report storage and generate that JSON file. One has a primary function of initializing and loading the JSON file's contents into the storage management database, but it also has a secondary function of reading the contents of the storage management database and ultimately displaying it for you in a hierarchical structure. So we'll look at that as well. Each transitioning utility is present in the bin folder of your 20.1 installation. I want to make a few important notes here. The utilities are non-destructive. They're only reading legacy content. They're not deleting or removing it. However, I'll make one last plug to please make a backup of your legacy content store before beginning this process. To use them, you'll open your command prompt as admin on Windows and cd into your bin directory of Exago. If you're running them on Linux, please ensure the execute permission bit is set on the utilities exe file. Okay. The first utility we're going to talk about is called Filesystem to JSON. As you might have guessed by the name, this utility is used to read report content from a local file system. It can read from one or more directories of reports, and it will generate an intermediate JSON file that describes the contents of your directories. Now, modifications can be made to the JSON file before loading content into the storage management database, but this is considered a non-traditional implementation, so it won't be the one that we're walking through today. We do have, I just want to give a quick shout out to our docs. We have an extensive suite of documentation on storage management and a full article dedicated to transitioning. We're going to link them to the hosted version of this lab recording afterwards, but I would really encourage you to go check out those docs, specifically the one on transitioning from legacy storage methods. It's got a whole lot more content than I could possibly fit in the lab today. So I'll mention it throughout, but please be sure to read those. All right. So one note here that we're going to be walking through, but if you don't need to make any modifications to the JSON file, you can actually skip this step and use load reports to DB to read directly from the file system repository. Now, we're going to talk about using file system to JSON first. So we have 2 scenarios on screen that we're going to talk about. The first uses default settings for the placement and naming of the created JSON file. The second is an example of specifying that via a third and optional argument in your command. In both examples, we're reading from a legacy file system reports directory, as well as a legacy themes directory from our 19.2 installation. We'll take a look at one of these on screen and we'll do one of them together. So again, to use this utility or any other, open your command prompt as an administrator and navigate to your bin directory of Exago. You'll see I've done that here, and in just a moment, you'll see that I've done it locally as well. We're then going to call file system to JSON. We're going to give it 2 directories to read from. So in the top example, I included only those 2 directories, no additional parameters. You can specify additional directories by separating them with a space. And of course, make sure to wrap file paths with spaces in them, such as between program and files in quotes like you see. Now you can also specify an optional third parameter here, and that's going to be the name and location of that output file. So I used this approach. I chose to name the file Filesystem Contents and save it right on the C drive. I'm going to just grab that. We're going to go ahead and run this one live together. So you should be able to see my command prompt on screen. And this is the command that we just saw on the slide here. So we're calling file system to JSON. We've got our two directories, and then we're actually going to place that file on the C drive. So we can go ahead and run it. It'll actually indicate to me that it's reading from my reports directory. It's also going to indicate separately that it reads from the themes directory. And if we go to the file system, we will see this new file here. You can look at the timestamp if you'd like, just created by that utility. So we'll look at those contents in just a moment, but it's really that simple to go ahead and generate the file for file system reports and themes. Now in file system storage, all users have access to all content, and restriction is built in on the role level. So file system to JSON will accordingly grant all access to all content. We're going to see that when we look at the JSON file generated by this utility. I'm showing you on screen the default file, so run by that first command that we didn't do together live, filesystem.json, and it's located in the directory that filesystem to JSON was run from, so the bin directory of my Exago install if unspecified. I also wanted to point out a log file. This log file is called filesystem to json.log. It's also saved to the install directory of filesystem to JSON. If you are looking for troubleshooting assistance or you need to submit a ticket to our support team, this file is very helpful. Please include it on that ticket or take a look yourself if you'd like to begin the troubleshooting process. All right, so I'll keep an eye on the questions pane. We're going to move on to database to JSON, but as always, feel free to submit any questions. Like I said, we've got the whole gang here today to make sure that we can keep all your questions answered. All right, so database to JSON is the same idea, but it's used to read report content and access permissions from a source database and generate that JSON file. It's designed for transitioning existing implementations of Exago's folder management example to storage management. Today, I'm going to use a base non-customized example of folder management. This is the version that was previously available on the support site. That will serve as my legacy solution, and we'll transition over to storage management in 20.1. Now, one other way that you might use database to JSON, if you set up storage management for the first time using a SQLite file, which certainly is perfectly acceptable for testing. We all did it internally the first time as well. But then, of course, you'll subsequently transition to a production database post-testing. And this utility can be used to aid in that process as well. Please keep that in mind. Although the utilities are primarily designed to be used at the onset of your migration process, they can be very handy later on. So don't sort of write them off as you move on in the process. Now, because we're talking about legacy database storage, I want to introduce the concept of orphaned reports and explain what might happen to them. This is also not something that we expect to happen to a lot of people, but an orphaned report is one that's not attached to any folder, including the root, or attached to a folder that cannot be traced from the root. This really only occurs if we're missing a record in the legacy folder management's database access table. Orphaned reports will be imported into their own folder called Orphaned Reports. So they're not lost, they're not deleted, they're clearly plucked out and stored for you. You'll just want to make sure to reassign it to a new home in that migration process. All right, so a couple nuances to database to JSON. It's going to read a file in the installation directory called database to json.config.json. This file can hold information about one or more database configurations that you would like the utility to read from. So these are configurations on legacy folder management databases. Now, the most important thing I want to tell you about this file is that it does need to be created manually. It does not exist when you first install 20.1. You do need to create it. We have examples in that great article on our support site. The file itself is fairly simple. It'll have a name for the configuration. That name can be specified in the command line when you're running the exe. So you'll see I have folder management as my first configuration here. SQLite is my second one. I can actually use that right in my command to specify which configuration I would like to use. It asks for a database type, provider, and connection string. So I can, this might be SQLite, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, or Postgres, pretty standard there. The driver or the provider is just the driver used to connect to the source. You can actually likely find that or a hint towards it in your database settings of the admin console if you're not sure, so that might be a good place to start. We then have the content SQL. This is a SQL statement used to read content from your folder management database. You will want to make sure this matches up to whatever columns you have in your source database, particularly if you've customized the legacy database storage. Similarly, the access SQL will be used to read access rights from the appropriate table in the source database. And then finally, we want the path and file name for the output file. If no path is specified here, the file will be saved to the directory database to JSON is run from, which of course will be our bin folder of the Exago installed by default. You'll notice here in my folder management configuration, I've specified the output file to be placed on the C drive and called folder management content.json. So I have moved that from the default storage location. All right, so you'll also notice that in the install in your bin directory, you'll already have a file called database-to-json.exe.config. This is an XML file that can be used instead of the JSON file I'm showing you here. Part of the advantages of using the JSON file is the ability to name each configuration and therefore have multiple defined in that file. This default file, which again is present when you first install, can only hold a single configuration for a folder management legacy system. Great. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and run database to JSON using one of the configurations specified in that first file that I showed you, the JSON file. This is probably the simplest exe to run, though it does require some setup beforehand. But once since I've already done the configuration work in that file, I can go ahead and call it right off the bat. Runs very quickly, lets me know when it's all set, and gives me a little summary. I didn't have too much in that folder management implementation, as you can see. And now we're going to have folder management content.json, a new JSON file, and it's stored right on the C drive like I wanted. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about, yes, so this is the scenario that we just ran. We placed it on our C drive and renamed it. Let's go ahead to the next one, great. So you can manually edit the resulting JSON file, just like I mentioned with the other ones. For today, we're going to skip this step, but again, in that article, Storage Management, Transitioning from Legacy Storage Methods, that will be linked to this video, there is a section detailing the intermediate JSON file, and we are going to talk about the contents of the file in just a moment. I just wanted to point out first that database to JSON also creates and stores a log file to the installation directory of the database to JSON utility. So again, if you're looking for troubleshooting assistance or need to submit a ticket, this is where you'd like to go. All right, so very briefly, let's talk about options for transitioning from a cloud storage method. With cloud storage, you can actually transition one of 4 ways. You can download your cloud storage to the file system and then use Filesystem to JSON, just like we did, to create that JSON file. You can use Cloud to JSON to do the same without downloading your report storage, or in either case, you can use load reports to DB directly. As I mentioned before, and we'll demonstrate in a minute, load reports to DB has the option to read the file system or cloud storage directly and skip the intermediate JSON step. Now let's talk about that file. So you can make changes to this, but as it's not a typical implementation, we're just going to look at the content that's created and stored today. The content JSON includes some values that are going to be null for file system or cloud legacy storage methods, such as owner ID, created by, modified by. The file system does not store this information. It also includes a JSON object of metadata. You can see that starting here, as well as a report access list. The metadata part of the JSON file holds a few not yet implemented bits of info, such as sort, order, and extended attributes. It also holds general info about the content, such as content XML for most reports, content data for templates or other binary objects. It'll hold the name, the content ID, so on and so forth. For a full list, check out that article. It walks through this file in depth. Now for file system content, the access flags will always be set to full access. So you'll see that here represented by this 65535 value. And additionally, the report access list will be subsequently empty. This will hold info such as the parent and party type ID of each content element. So again, makes sense that it's empty for file system or cloud storage content. However, if we look at an example of the JSON file generated by database to JSON, we can see a bit more info is stored. We'll have owner ID created by and modified by, all populated with values associated with the user that last touched the report or created the report. Additionally, we do have an entry in our report access list, since that info is stored in a legacy folder management implementation. Great. So at this point, we're going to move on to load reports to DB. Load reports to DB can be used for initializing the destination storage management database, loading content into it either from file system or cloud legacy storage methods or the JSON file, and reading the previously loaded contents of the new storage management database. When we initialize a database, we set it up with schema and default party types. This should always be the first operation run on the new database. Just a reminder, you do need to create that database first. We're going to do an example of this, and I will show you that I have created it, but it's empty before we actually initialize it and load anything into it. Reading can be used to verify a load operation by reading the contents of the database and displaying it in a hierarchical structure, but this can also be called at any time to review the database content, as well as default party types. Order of the parameters in the command line does matter, and we're going to walk through them because there are so many. I just wanted to sort of give a brief explanation of each. T, lowercase d, and C all go together in that they're specifying a configuration for the database. T is going to be the type, of course. So again, SQLite, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, and Postgres are your options there. Lowercase d is the driver used to connect to that database. So if T and D are not present, they are optional parameters, but they will default to SQLite. So if you're using any database other than SQLite, they are no longer optional, and you need to specify for your database. C is the connection string. It's a standard connection string for most databases. For SQLite, you'll need the path and file name. And of course, you won't need T and lowercase d in that case. The fourth one down, lowercase p, is an optional prefix for all of the storage management database tables. So for example, if you add test underscore as your prefix, it will cause all of the tables to be named test underscore content, so on and so forth, test storage meta, etc. You might also use this to specify a schema, though. So if you put DBO dot or another schema name, we will also prefix the tables with that string. Once you've used the transitioning utility, you do want to make sure that you match the prefix used in the admin console. So I will initialize the database, and we've talked about this one a little bit, but this means creating the tables, loading the default party types, and setting up the base configuration in the database. It will also create 2 new folders, public, which will have everyone permissions, and my reports with user permissions. If T is SQLite and the file does not already exist at the location specified by the connection string, the file will be created. So this is the only example of when you don't need to create the database beforehand. Okay, L will load the database. So this will read the intermediate JSON file created by database to JSON or file system to JSON and load contents into the storage management database. Real quick, I'd like to talk about reports with duplicate IDs. They will be given new IDs and a warning will be displayed. You might end up with duplicate IDs from using upload, download to modify and re-upload report files or manually messing around with report files on the file system. This message is not an indication of failure. You'll actually see it when we run this locally today, but it might cause scheduler services to lose track of the report. This means that the next time the report is saved, changes might not be pushed to the scheduler services. So to fix this, search for and delete duplicate GUIDs from each scheduler services working directory, and then just reschedule the report in the application to create a new scheduled job with the new ID. Capital D followed by a directory will read from a file system directory and load the contents. Theme directories can also be read with this parameter. If you wish to read and load multiple directories, they must each be prefixed with their own capital D. W followed by cloud spec will read from a cloud storage repository and load the contents. So the same thing as D for file system directories. R will read the file structure of, and I sort of say file structure in air quotes, but it will display it in a hierarchical structure of the storage management database and display it. This is useful for verifying contents after using any of our load commands here. So at this point, we're going to talk through quite a few examples of using this utility since there are so many different ways to use it. So the first 3, scenario A will initialize a SQL Server storage management database. Scenario B will load a SQL Server storage management database with content from an intermediate JSON file. And scenario C will initialize a SQLite storage management database and load file system contents. So in the third scenario, we are skipping the JSON file and loading directly from the file system. Now these first 3 we're going to look at in the slide deck, and then we'll do a couple together as well. Here we initialize a storage management database of type SQL Server. So you can see we use the T parameter as well as lowercase d and then C for the connection string. This is pretty standard. The database does already exist. I've created it prior. And finally, I use the standalone capital I to initialize the database or create those tables, load the default party types, and set up the base configuration. Next, we will load the same database from a JSON file created by file system to JSON. One thing I want to mention, the first and second scenarios here could be combined into one step by simply including the capital I parameter right before the capital L that you see here. Order is important, so make sure to initialize before loading. I find it helpful to do it in 2 separate steps, at least the first time, just to see the returns expected and understand where things went wrong if you do get an error. But it's of course possible to combine them. The third use case is to use load reports to DB to read directly from the file system. And we'll use a SQLite file this time just to show you the different usage of the parameters. We'll only need to specify the connection string. So you see I'm missing those T and lowercase d arguments in my command. And that's going to be a physical path to the file location, since the default values for type and driver are SQLite. If the file doesn't exist at that physical path, it will be created. After the I parameter, we'll use the capital D to specify each separate directory to read from, and we do need 2 of those. You'll note that in my return, I see loading from my reports directory and then separately loading from my themes directory. If I was missing this second D, I would see loading from my reports directory, and this second half would not be here. I won't get an error, it just won't read the second directory. All right, so we're going to cover a few more example scenarios, but we're going to do these together. So the first thing that we're going to do is initialize a SQL Server storage management database and load content from file system directories that I have locally. Scenario B will initialize a SQLite database and load content from an intermediate JSON file. And then scenario C will read that SQLite storage management database. So we'll show you what this hierarchical structure looks like. All right. So these are the commands that we're going to be using today. But the first thing I'd like to do is show you the database that we have. So storage management is the database we're going to be loading into. If I open up the tables, you'll see that we don't have any. So the database is created, but there's no content in it. I'm now going to run this command. So you'll see we have type SQL Server, we specify the driver, we have the connection string, we're going to initialize and then load from 2 separate directories all in one step. And we get our return. The first thing I want to point out is that it found the schema file in my install directory that it used to set up the database. It loaded from my first directory and then my second directory. And if we pop back into the database and refresh it, we should see more content here. So we have 4 tables: content, content access, party type, and storage meta. And I can go ahead and query this one, take a look at all of the content that we've added here. You can see we have content IDs as expected. The names are sort of the ones that give you an idea of what they are, and you can actually see that we have some themes, and we know which ones. So we have a crosstab forest theme, a legacy express view theme, so on and so forth. We have content for reports themes. It'll differ based on what it is, of course. We do have our My Reports folder. That's the one that was created by the system when I ran that utility. And then, of course, I have other folders as well. This was my support lab reports directory. So these are all different support labs that we've done in the past. All right. So the next thing that we're going to do is use a separate command to load a SQLite database from the JSON file generated by one of our previous utilities. And this time we're actually going to create and load a SQLite file. So we're going to take a look. You can see that this command, sorry about that. This command is going to load a SQLite file located in the bin directory of my local install called load reports to DB. So if we just go take a look at that location, you'll see that it does not exist right now. And then we'll see it populated. So we have load reports to db.exe, got a couple of config files and a log file, but no SQLite files. And if we run this one, so the connection string is a physical path to the file location with the name that I'd like to give it. And we're going to load from a JSON file. So we'll load from my file system contents.json. Again, it's found my schema file, so it created the necessary information in that SQLite file. Did find another duplicate ID, right? These are the same reports, so we're going to find the same duplicate ID here. Again, it's not an error, it's just an indication of warning so that you know what to do about it. And then it'll let me know that it's all set. And we now see load reports to db.sqlite in that location. Now, finally, we can use load reports to DB to read the database after we've set it up. So this command is very simple. We're going to use the arguments necessary to connect to the database. So that's more if you're connecting to a traditional database, and simply just the connection string if you're just going to the SQLite file. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to read the SQLite file that we just loaded with simply the R command. So this one's fun because it gives you an entire hierarchical structure. We'll start back at the top. So I mentioned this was my support lab's reports repository. So we have the chain reports lab that we did, the combination charts one, got a whole bunch of fun ones in here. I'd like to go down to the interactive HTML set of reports because this shows you how we can have additional structure. We had a folder within interactive HTML called Executive Dashboard Reports, and then within that we had additional reports. So it will indent for each level there. Finally, at the bottom, I have my themes, so you'll see all of the themes were loaded as well. All right. Great. So I would like to talk now about the admin console settings that you will need to update once you have used any combination of these utilities to ultimately load a storage management database. We know that at the top here we have assembly location and class name. These were briefly reviewed in Travis's lab with the overview of storage management a couple of days ago. So I'm going to focus today on the settings that you need to update to match the values supplied in the transitioning utilities. Beginning with the database section. Just like we specified the type, provider, and connection string in the load reports to DB utility, we're going to need to do the same thing here. So you'll select a type, provider, and the connection string that match what we used in the utility. Should feel very familiar. This is not anything crazy. Now we've already initialized our database, so we don't need to prepare it. The prepare database button here would do the same thing. We can simply click check database settings to verify that we can connect successfully and all of the tables are there as expected. Now, check database settings will not work successfully if we supplied a table prefix in the utilities and forget to put it here first, or vice versa. Everything needs to match so that it's looking for the content that you have actually loaded into the database. We talked about check database settings, but let's talk about the other three buttons here. Prepare database is just like initialize in the utilities. It's used to create the 4 tables in an already existing storage management database. It loads default party types into the party type table and creates the public and my reports folders if they don't already exist. This will also update schema if necessary on an existing and already set up database. It is also non-destructive, so additive only. The button just to its left can be very helpful if you're not sure what SQL is going to be sent to your database using prepare database. It's essentially like using the show SQL button in the advanced designer. You can get a look at what we're going to send to the database before we actually send it. You can make sure it's what you want. It's pretty straightforward. On the right, the load themes will load chart, express view, crosstab, and geochart themes from the web app installed directory into the storage management database. So this is only necessary for first-time installs of Exago on version 20.1 or after upgrading to storage management from a legacy storage mechanism if themes were not imported using one of the transitioning utilities. Finally, we have the identity parameter values and default settings / content access permissions, right? That those two 4th and 5th sections on the page here. We're not going to walk through these today. The last step of transitioning is to update your API code to correctly pass these values, right? The idea is not that you set these in the admin console and then leave them. The idea is that specifically for the identity parameters, they are updated on a session-by-session basis. So we have dedicated a whole lab to permissioning because it is such a crucial part of storage management. Please make sure to tune in to the third installation next Tuesday at 11 to see the storage management permissioning lab and learn all about this section. So a quick recap of today's lab content. We went through a whole bunch. We went through the transitioning process overview, took a deep dive into how to read content from the file system or from the database. We did talk about how to transition from cloud storage, even though we didn't do it together today. We reviewed a couple different ways to load the storage management database and took a look at the JSON file that the first two utilities will create and ultimately you can use to load the storage management database. And then finally, we talked about the few admin console settings that you need to adjust to match what you've done in the utilities. We really encourage you to continue to attend our lab series or at least catch the recordings. We've got another one on the 21st. That one will be about the permissioning, like I mentioned. And then on the 23rd, so next Thursday, we have a lab about customizing storage management. So that one should be really fun. We're going to take the out-of-box implementation and do some different things to it. As always, please let us know what you thought about today's lab in the survey and any topics that you would like to see covered in the future outside of the additional storage management ones that we have planned.
Hey, Emma, could I jump in for just one moment? A great question came in earlier in the lab that I think might be relevant to the group or might be a good heads up for anyone, including folks listening to the recording. So someone asked, how do user preferences play into storage management and what do they require in terms of migration? So user preferences can be handled without any extensibility or any features like that using local storage in the browser. And we've covered user preferences in a past lab in more detail. But previously in 19.2 in our previous versions, we provided as part of folder management a server event to store user preferences into a database. If you want to continue using that server event, you certainly can. User preferences are not currently being taken over by storage management. So while previously we provided all the code samples for those two extensibility features in the same utility, in the same DLL, you can separate those, so we would have them separate. In terms of migration, you don't have to do anything special for user preferences that are referencing reports. If they reference by name, by report path, the next time they're loaded into Exago, they'll be updated to use the ID instead. So you don't have to do any special migration. You just want to carry on using the user preferences where they are and how you're already using them. That's A-OK.
Awesome. Thanks, Travis. It looks like we're pretty good on the rest of the questions. If you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to submit a services ticket. We would love to talk to you more about your migration processes. And listen, thank you so much again. We really love the interaction and we appreciate that you guys utilize these webinars. So have a great rest of your week and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.